out of there! Duck, for God's sakes! Holy smokes! Dive, 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 dive. Get the head! Holy smokes! Oh! That guy! Holy mother! Oh, that guy got me to the...
2 to 3 times a day, tourists are taken on a tour through Chicago in the bus of the Untouchables, learning what it was like to live in the city back in the 1920s.
Oh, jeez. Did we lose anybody? Wait, one guy in the back. Put your finger right in the hole there, pal. Hold it like they tell it in the army there now. Just hold it. Oh, that was close. That was close there. All right, now shut up and listen up. Now, you're in Chicago. You don't got to know a lot to get by. Now, I don't know if you ever been to Chicago during the 1920s before, but I'll tell you right now, it's a rough town. You got to keep your eyes peeled. You never know what could happen. You don't even have to look for trouble, and you can find it sometimes. So keep your eyes peeled. You hear or you see something, yell out, warn everybody else, all righty?
Between 1920 and 1929, the economy is very good in Chicago. The city is booming, and so is organized crime. Rival gangs divide the city into territories, which they constantly fight over using methods that can hardly be described as peaceful. Even today, some people are still fascinated by these wild times. In Chicago, the Club of the Merry Gangsters has been founded.
I would love to have lived in the 20s.
Time of, an economic boom up until the Great Depression. A lot of people were doing very well.
I like the attitudes and the social structure of the time.
It was an era, I think, of a lot of fun.
It's a period in history that I really find fascinating.
You could be a secretary by day and be a gangster's girlfriend at night. I think that would have been terrifically exciting.
I don't think I would have liked to have been a gangster. I might have been good at it, but I don't think I have the emotional makeup for it. It's a very high-pressure profession.
In 1920, a stranger arrives in Chicago. In his hometown, New York, he only managed to make his mark as a small-time gangster among the other small-time criminals. Now he is ready for something new. His name, Al Capone. In his own lifetime, he will become the biggest gangster of all time. He has been the subject of scientific research and is adored by true and faithful fans.
This one is, of course, I'll just pass him over to Connie to my left. We'll go around clockwise. This is Capone on the way to prison in Atlanta. I have no reason why he's smiling.
The members of the Merry Gangster fan club meet every few weeks to exchange information, anecdotes, and gossip.
Yeah, exactly. You always get the photographers and newsboys a good picture. He's got a cigar in his hand. He was playing cards with the U.S. Marshal and...
Perfectly dressed.
Oh, of course. Never had a bad day.
Right.
On arrival in Chicago, Al Capone meets up with his old friend Johnny Torrio. Torrio is working for the undisputed king of Chicago's underworld, Big Jim Colosimo. Colosimo came to Chicago 40 years ago and worked as a street cleaner before creating his own lucrative source of income, a protection racket. He promised to protect acquaintances in return for regular payments. By doing this, Colosimo worked his way up to become the undisputed head of the underworld. Directly or indirectly, he is involved in practically every illegal business. The owners of illegal gambling halls live a quiet life as long as they can deliver a regular payment to Colosimo. Due to his good contacts, all those who pay for their protection are left alone by the police. Everyone is happy. The gamblers enjoy their game, the owners enjoy their profits, the corrupt police improve their modest salaries, and the king of the underworld continues to build his empire.
Hey, wait a minute. What are you doing?
Al Capone fits into Colosimo's plans and is made a debt collector. The rules are straightforward, and most people play by them. 9 out of 10 illegal gambling halls pay Colosimo their protection money.
And it would start at the top, money would go to the mayor, and end up at the bottom with money being stuffed in the pockets of police captains, police sergeants, and other lower-ranking police officials.
Those who do not wish to be protected by Colosimo receive a visit either by the police or Al Capone. Capone is infamous for his brutality. Dead bodies litter the streets. The second line of business is prostitution, equally if not more profitable than the protection racket. However, just as Colosimo is established, a new law is introduced, which severely disrupts his business. Starting in January 1920, prohibition comes into effect. The manufacture, trade, and consumption of alcohol is prohibited.
Nobody believed in prohibition, I don't think. See, prohibition was started by a women's group in Evanston called the WCTU, which is the Women's Christian Temperance Union. But they were the only ones that believed in it. I don't know how they influenced the national government, but they did. And so everybody enjoyed cheating on that law. As a matter of fact, my wife and I used to go down to a speakeasy, believe it or not, in the basement of the Chicago Board of Education building at LaSalle Street and Weicker Drive, where they'd open the slide, and if they recognized you, they'd let you in. They served your alcoholic drinks in teacups, which was to prove to you that you were doing something illegal.
Secret clubs, speakeasies, serve illegal alcohol. Only checked friends are admitted. However, enjoying alcohol remains dangerous. The government initiates raids to combat illegal alcohol traders. The result is a further increase in the price of alcohol. Capone sees the potential in the alcohol trade and suggests to his boss, Colosimo, that he gets involved. However, Colosimo is too busy, mixed up in his own divorce. His new love is very demanding, and he has no time for business. Al makes use of Colosimo's weakness to get rid of the opera lover. With Colosimo's death, Al Capone is now the number 2 in the hierarchy of the mafia. Only Torrio is above him. Together, Torrio and Capone enter the illegal alcohol trade, a successful and remarkable move for Capone after arriving in Chicago as a poor immigrant.
Prohibition provided Capone with an exciting, lucrative opportunity to become a millionaire. On the one hand, the potential for profits were extremely high, and on the other hand, the possibility of being arrested, incarcerated, punished, though that possibility was low. So this was an ideal market situation for Capone to enter.
He was an immigrant who was faced with a lot of adversity when he came to America. I don't think there were a lot of opportunities by way of education or job opportunities for him. So he became a criminal.
Today, ferries leave Manhattan Harbor to circumnavigate the Statue of Liberty several times a day. Millions of tourists admire the Statue of Liberty, for decades a symbol of the New World and unlimited opportunities. The round trip also takes the tourists to Ellis Island. Up until the 1950s, this small island just off the New York shoreline used to be the first arrival point for immigrants coming to America. At the turn of the century, hundreds of thousands of immigrants from all over the world were heading for the United States. The landing stage, which fascinated tourists use today, was once a path leading to an uncertain future. It was here that the new arrivals, equipped with only a few belongings, hoped to be able to make a new start. In 1894, Gabriella and Teresa Capone and their 2 sons also land here. The family finds a home in Brooklyn, among the other Italian and Irish immigrants.
He was also a victim of his family's financial situation. They were poor. They lived in East Side. So, it was a ghetto. And even like today in many large American cities, there's poor areas where there just aren't opportunities for people other than criminal activity. I mean, that seems like the easy way out.
In 1899, Alphonse Capone is born. He starts to follow his older brothers around, and together the kids join a street gang. Within the gang, Al soon finds his way around, becoming streetwise and able to hold his own.
In those days, that was the thing to do. To join a street gang, that was your protection.
The father works as a barber to earn a living for the family of 9. He is left with little time or money and can only offer fatherly love and a few sweets.
I took all the candy man. Let's go.
Gabriel Capone wanted his boys to learn the value of $1. When each child reached the age of maybe 11, 12, he would build them a shoeshine box. In Al's case, he gave him a shoeshine box. Somebody had told Gabriel where to send his son to shine shoes. They may pick up a couple of bucks over the weekend. A couple of bucks means the most $2 over the weekend.
Even at school, Al Capone is disruptive. When his teacher tells him off, he decides never to go back.
After school, Al Capone came under the influence of Frankie Yale. He was about 6 years older than him, 7 years older, like that. But already he was enveloping into, a boss. Frankie Yale asked him to look in the mirror and concentrate and try to perfect a dangerous look. You don't even have to open your mouth. Just look at the guy like this. The look is going to tell the guy, either you do what I tell you or I'm going to kill you.
Frankie Yale offers Capone a job in one of his bars in Coney Island, the place where New Yorkers go to have a good time. Capone's acquaintances are gangsters and his girlfriends are prostitutes. It is here that he catches syphilis, a disease which he never completely recovers from. A fight over a woman also leaves him with deep knife cuts and scars on his left cheek. This earns him the nickname Scarface, a name he deeply hates. Never again will he allow his photo to be taken from the left side. Al Capone moves forward in an organized way, planning and striking accurately.
Al nearly killed a man, an Irishman, named Finnegan, last name Finnegan. And when Frankie Yale found out about it, he got him a job. He called up Chicago and got him to go out to Chicago because this here Finnegan belonged to Wild Bill Lovett. And he knew that this Wild Bill Lovett was a madman. He was going to track, when he gets his mind to something, that's it. He's going to find you, especially with them scars for ID. So you go out to Chicago.
If he had stayed there, I think New York would have become the center of gangland. But he brought all of his know-how and nastiness with him to Chicago. And in Chicago, there was one man who ran it all, and that was Capone.
Little Italy in Chicago is to Capone in many ways similar to New York. Newcomers look for the districts where people from their own country live. You live, work, marry, raise your children, and then die, all within your own district. The families support each other and live according to their own laws. The number one principle is that they take care of themselves rather than involving the local authorities.
Italians were very much to themselves. The Irish were to themselves, and so were the Germans. And each one had retained their own cultures. And part of that culture was, for instance, the Italians and their love for wine, and the Irish for their love of whiskey and beer. So when Prohibition came in, it was completely foreign to the immigrant population in Chicago. So to them, it was only natural to start to produce alcohol. But then, as they produced the alcohol, they realized that they could also make a lot of money off of it, because there was a large community to serve by selling it. So I think that's probably why Chicago became the center of gangland in Prohibition.
After his father's death, Al moves the rest of the family from New York to Chicago. Together, the Capone brothers set up a professionally organized alcohol trade. With Torio's permission, old breweries and distilleries around Chicago are reopened. From production to bar, everything is taken care of and tightly organized.
The cobwebs of years of neglect were swept from back. Armies of men were called to polish the brewing machinery, put the long-neglected plants in perfect order for the rush of business that was certain to come. Another impetus was given to business when the president put his name to the beer bill.
Ralph was the one who rose the highest. He ended up being involved in beer distribution, probably in the sales of beer, which apparently accounts for his nickname Bottles. The other brothers tended to have more minor jobs, never really rose high in Chicago gangland, even in the 50s, 60s, etc.
The original complex stood on the foundation of this building here, was put up in 1857. Burned down only about 2 weeks after it was built. The first time they lit the kilns up to start making beer, apparently there was a problem and the whole place burned to the ground.
Corrupt politicians also kept the illegal trade going. Chicago's Mayor Bill Thompson was not opposed to the occasional drink. After Thompson loses the election, Capone's gang pulls out of Chicago's city center. They want to establish new headquarters in the suburb of Cicero, which is perfect for running the business. It is small, straightforward, and easy to govern. And last but not least, it is easy to manipulate the election of a new mayor.
The tendency is to think that Capone was always the one who initiated the bribes. But in fact, politicians and police officers sometimes initiated the corruption. And as I say, there was this close exchange relationship between the politicians and the police on the one hand and Al Capone on the other.
Police officers earned very little money, but the mob saw that they got regular payoff lists. The mob kept regular books with the names of all of the patrolmen and the sergeants and the lieutenants in there, and they got regular contributions, and most of them took the money because they weren't earning very much in those days and they needed it. And in exchange for that, some police officers became informants for the mob, told them when there was going to be raids and stuff so they could hide the things. Other ones just looked the other way when things happened.
They bribed the officials, they handpicked the local candidates, they terrorized the voters. By the time the carefully delayed news of what was happening reached the state capitol, by the time the National Guard arrived on the scene, it was too late. The polls were closed, Cicero had been taken.
The electorate are gently persuaded to vote for the candidate that the Capones support. The people of Cicero are incensed. Police forces which are not yet corrupt are brought in from Chicago, but Capone still achieves his goal. And the alcohol-friendly mayor wins the election, but the price is high. Frank Capone, killed in a shootout with the police. The closely knit Capone family are in shock.
Capone had sort of a dual life. On on the one hand, there's Al Capone, the man with his wife and family in the house with the brothers and whoever else was staying there, his mother and sister on Prairie Avenue. Maybe he spent 3 days a week on Prairie Avenue looking like a typical family man. On the other hand, he was a gangster, and being a gangster involves violence because that's the only way that they have to enforce the agreements they make. So he could be a very violent individual, especially with people who double-crossed him.
I think that particular view, that view that says Capone was a psychological misfit, I think that falls down, though. It falls down because Capone was able to form some emotionally close relationships during his life. He obviously had loving relationships with his son, with his wife, with his brothers, as well as with members of his gang.
Despite the close family relationship, Vincenzo, the oldest son, leaves the house one day and never returns. Vincenzo sends a letter telling them that he is well, but no one knows of his whereabouts. Despite their search, the Capones never find him. Sometime in 1920, a man steps off a train in Nebraska. At the town hall in Homer, he registers himself as Richard Hart.
He didn't want the family to find him, for what reason I don't know. And he changed his name, as far as we know, because he was interested in a movie star that was called William S. Hart.
He leads a modest, inconspicuous lifestyle, marries and has 4 children. He earns a living as a painter, but when prohibition is introduced, he decides to join the police. Vincenzo, alias Richard Hart, engages in a relentless fight for prohibition.
My father was very strong-willed, and he knew what he wanted to do, and he was afraid of nobody at any time. And he was very, very tough.
Richard Hart becomes known for his brutal crusade against illegal distillers. Nobody would believe that this strict teetotaler was the brother of the very man who a few thousand miles away earned a fortune in the illegal alcohol trade.
Tell me he was part of the Capone family. He never told my mother. He never mentioned a word. Even after he went back to the family, he never talked about any of it all. And he hardly ever mentioned as far as him being a brother of Capone.
Al Capone had established himself as an illegal alcohol trader and had plenty to laugh about. Enjoys all of life's great pleasures, visiting shady bars and hosting lavish parties. He always finds time for an enjoyable game of billiards. He loves to surround himself with boxers and jockeys, and he also manages to have the media on his side.
Al Capone was very good at public relations. He used to duck the press when they would try to take his pictures. He would swing at them or threaten their lives. And one day, a newspaper photographer named Tony Berardi, who was also a boxer, took Capone aside and says, you're making a fool of yourself, and these newspaper guys can make you look ridiculous when you put your hat in front of your face and hide like that. He says, cooperate with them and they'll be nicer to you.
we went to lunch there, and of course we had the booze, which we all wanted, and it was Prohibition time. And after the lunch, Capone passed around these cigars. They were Havana cigars. Well, I was a cigar smoker. I was smoking 10 cigars a day, but they were nickel cigars. And I unwrapped the Havana cigar that he gave us and lit it and started smoking. And I enjoyed it so much, I raved about it. And when I left the luncheon, he handed me a box of 50 of those cigars as a gift. And I never could smoke a cheap cigar after that, the rest of my life.
Despite all this, Capone never forgets to keep an eye on the business. Torrio and the other rival gangs have divided the city. Torrio and Capone control Southside, where most of the Italian immigrants live. Their biggest opponent, Dino Banyan, reigns in the North Side, where the Irish, Bohemians, Austrians, and Germans live. On the surface, O'Banion appears to be a loving family man and a harmless flower seller. However, the flower shop is the headquarters of the cold-blooded, calculating Irish gang. O'Banion plans to extend his territory. When Capone hears of this, he sends his best men to thwart O'Banion's plans. On November 10th, O'Banion arranges his shop window, just as he does every morning, when a car stops in front of the shop. O'Banion is shot dead. Immediately, a crowd of reporters gather around the front of his shop. Everybody in the city knows that this killing is the beginning of a merciless gang war. Jaime Weiss, O'Banion's successor, seeks revenge. One by one, Capone's best men are brutally killed off in the Irish gang's bloodthirsty revenge. In only a few weeks, there are more than a dozen deaths.
Very, very, very effective.
In 1924, the Tommy gun is introduced, and the gangs profit from the weapon industry's latest invention. Within a very short time, it becomes the gangsters' favorite weapon.
Really? The body spins before they hit the ground.
You mean crime scene, is that?
Yes. You can fire it from the shoulder, and it's a heavy gun. You have to adjust your weight to fire it from the shoulder. You need to lean forward to compensate for the weight of the gun, which is largely back here, to maintain your balance. If you fire from the hip, there isn't that much of a kick. I guess that's sort of a myth about the big kick of the Thompson, but you fire from the hip pretty much like this, and you don't have to adjust your weight, so you can stand level. And then, of course, if you fire the whole magazine, you got to put another one in. Now, again, for practical purposes, if you can't kill a guy with 50 rounds or can't get your work done now, you may as well change profession.
Capone himself learns to appreciate the true power of this new weapon. On August 10th, 1924, his arch-enemy Jaime Weiss finally attempts to assassinate Capone. Assassination fails. Capone survives. Jaime Weiss knows that this is his own death sentence.
Jaime Weiss keeps the flower shop as his headquarters. Right next door was Mrs. Rafferty's boarding house, a 3-story building. Al rents apartments facing the street. He puts machine gunners in the rooms, sitting there waiting for what the police estimated was about 2 weeks, judging by the layers of cigars and cigarette butts right along the ledge of the windows as they sat there keeping in a vigil. Jaime Weiss had a habit of coming every day from the north side of Chicago. He would take his big touring car and make a half-circle turn right in the middle of the street and always park the car in front of the front door of Holy Name.
Jaime Weiss dies, and Bugs Moran becomes his successor, who hits back by seriously wounding John Torrio. After his convalescence, Torrio decides to retire. Now Capone is the boss. he can continue in the way he wants to. Al Capone's working week consists of 4 days. During this time, he resides in the noble Lexington Hotel. After a leisurely breakfast and studying the daily press, he makes a few phone calls and takes his time dressing himself in fine clothes. By early afternoon, he moves to his study in the hotel suite, where his colleagues wait in hope of advice and decisions.
He probably would, in some sense, have been a bit like a medieval king in terms of his basic workday. There were people lined up waiting to approach the throne to ask the king for something, either some help, a favor, or the king would have to make a decision in terms of who would be appointed what, giving out commissions in the army, let's say. Well, Al would give people certain positions running gambling houses, etc. People would approach Al about, what should we do about beer sales? What about this? What about that? We're having this problem. We're having that problem. It would be up to Al Capone quite frequently as the boss to solve it if it couldn't be solved lower.
The organization functioned as a business. With Al Capone as the boss or chairman of the board and a board of directors. Each board director had a very specific function in the organization, either accounting or running stills or running a particular street crew that was responsible for carrying out various activities that would bring in money and then kick it back to the board of directors and Al Capone.
However, the larger the organization, the more complicated and intricate the business, and his opponents become more and more troublesome. In particular, the Irish gang's boss, Bugs Moran. Capone decides to get rid of him.
Don't be so rough, Copper.
In February 1929, Bugs Moran receives a phone call. The caller offers a shipment of whiskey. The price is good, so Moran is interested. A meeting is scheduled for February the 14th, Valentine's Day. But instead of the dealer, the police show up. Moran's men readily raise their hands, thinking that the police are only interested in the whiskey. However, the supposed policemen are not interested in whiskey. The 7 members of the Moran gang are massacred. Only Moran himself manages to escape.
A lot of the gangland killings carried out by the Capone organization were very well organized, very well managed. In the extreme case of St. Valentine's Day Massacre, it was well set up, preparation weeks in advance, almost sort of a military operation in some sense. The gunmen were imported from out of town, so that the Moran gangsters would not recognize them by sight. You'd have to get the weapons, you would have to get the cars, you would have to have a place to hold these men while the lookouts, who themselves had to be organized, were able to call and say, okay, we think they're all there now. Then you have to have a way to dispose of all the stuff and get these guys back out of town again.
The massacre receives a lot of public attention. 7 killings in one incident is too much, even for Chicago. However, Capone does not even consider hiding out. On the contrary, he intensifies his contacts to certain reporters.
It took 7 men to be killed, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, before you got much attention in Chicago, whereas in other cities, if 3 men were killed, it was already a massacre, and they're calling for a crackdown on the gangs.
We didn't have television in those days, and not everyone had radios either, but so it was, we learned of Capone by the newspapers, and I think the newspaper men had a part in making him the legend that he was, if you could call him a legend.
After all, he gave me my liquor, and he gave all of us newspaper men our liquor. Not only did he have speakeasies, but he furnished us with personal gifts of booze, of the kind of whiskey we wanted, or whether it was gin or whether it was whatever, any kind. I mean, all we had to do was ask him, and we got it, and we didn't have to pay for it. It was a gift.
Those of the reporters who Capone considered to be friends were protected by him.
And for instance, if anybody got robbed, burglarized or anything, Capone would find the guy that did it to you and kill him. There was no trials. Not all of these lawyers making money in the millions like they are with the Clinton affairs. The people that were bothering his friends were eliminated from life.
The autumn of 1929 brings the Great Depression, which gives Al Capone an opportunity to gain good publicity through charity. He presents himself as a modern-day Robin Hood, taking from the rich to give to the poor.
It was a time when people didn't have much money. Thousands and thousands of people were out of work, and they were looking for folk heroes and things like that, and they didn't like the politicians.
Capone was an equal opportunity employer. It wasn't just Italians or Sicilians. He employed people from various ethnic groups. And I think that was important. He hired on the basis of who could do the job rather than who was in his same kinship group.
The number of unemployed people rises to hundreds of thousands. Parents cannot even provide food for their own children. Al Capone is one of the first to set up a soup kitchen. Again, Capone receives favorable press.
The guy did a heck of a lot of good for the city of Chicago. During the Depression, he built food stations for the poor people. They had their meals every day, all over the city.
Capone certainly paid to run a soup kitchen on South State Street, just south of the Loop, the downtown area, in Chicago in 1929, 1930. I think that was more of a public relations ploy. He was, going to trial for income tax evasion, and it wasn't long thereafter that the kitchen was closed. So I think this was a way to try and show to the public what a good guy Al Capone was. It wasn't that unemployment went away when they closed the soup kitchens. It was that I believe the trial had begun, and there wasn't anything more to be done on the public relations side.
Capone's involvement in charity can no longer help him. Behind the scenes, the authorities have already collected a vast amount of material against him. Nevertheless, they are not able to prove him guilty of a single crime.
The Illinois Crime Survey, which was published in 1929, concluded that the criminal justice system in Chicago was paralyzed. It could not move. Al Capone was beyond the reach of the law.
There was one man whose single goal in life was to get Capone behind bars. State Prosecutor George Johnson.
Al Capone made Chicago famous for its gang. My father tried to make Chicago famous for law enforcement, culture, and background. This was the home of Al Capone, but he was also the home of my father, George Q. Johnson. One had to go.
Corruption is everywhere, and State Prosecutor Johnson cannot even trust the members of his own department.
Johnson started out with a padlocking drive, and the padlocking drive consisted of getting court orders to shut down saloons and other places in Chicago that were selling Capone's alcohol. That didn't work because the prohibition agents who were supposed to put the padlocks on the door sometimes didn't do it. That frustrated Johnson.
Johnson intends to wear Capone down. Again and again, Capone faces losses from large-scale raids executed by security forces. Capone feels the noose getting tighter around his neck. Capone threatens to kill Johnson's family, and they are given police protection, allowing the prosecutors to carry on with their investigation. Their new strategy is to charge Capone with tax evasion, and indeed they finally find something. They calculate that between 1924 and 1929, Capone evaded a total of $215,000. For Capone, there is no way out, and in October of 1931, he is charged with tax evasion. Al Capone still believes he is untouchable, but the indictment is watertight. On top of this, Capone makes a crucial mistake.
He had an opportunity to hire one of the best attorneys in Chicago. And this was a man who'd been a federal prosecutor. This is a man who actually had worked with George E.Q. Johnson. The story goes that this private attorney made Capone an offer. For $100,000, he would represent Capone in the tax case. Capone, who by some accounts was a cheapskate when it came to some personal matters, declined the offer. Thought it was too much money. And instead, Capone made a very stupid decision. He hired Michael Ahern and Associates, and Ahern was mainly experienced in the area of defending thugs and defending, street criminals. Ahern was a polished attorney, yes. Very skillful attorney, yes. Was he an expert in tax law? No.
At the end of the trial, George Johnson, in his final speech, succeeds in destroying the Robin Hood myth Capone has created. The jury agrees with the prosecution. Capone is found guilty of tax evasion. The numerous capital crimes carried out by his organization were never mentioned during the trial. Nevertheless, the king is brought down. 11 years of prison are waiting for him. Al Capone is transferred to Atlanta by train. There he serves his first year in prison. After this, he receives a transfer to the brand new high-security prison, Alcatraz. It is located on a small island in the Bay of San Francisco. Up to 200 prisoners are to be kept here. The modern security measures and the dangerous currents surrounding the island make an escape virtually impossible. Alcatraz houses the most brutal and unpredictable criminals as inmates: robbers, murderers, and gangsters. Al Capone is the only one to be kept in Alcatraz for tax evasion. On August 22, 1934, Al Capone's cell door is locked for the first time. From now on, the big gangster boss is known as inmate number 85. There are other changes. The syphilis that he caught as a young man is taking its toll. Some days he seems mentally vacant, whereas on other days his mind is clear and sharp. In January 1936, the inmates start to rebel and want to make Capone their leader. But Al knows it's pointless and refuses. He is right, and the inmates' rebellion is brutally suppressed. Many of his fellow inmates are unforgiving of his lack of loyalty, and they plan their revenge. The prison barbershop seems to offer the best opportunity. The attempted assassination takes place in the barbershop, where tourists now wander. In June 1936, a lifer attacks Capone with a pair of scissors. Capone survives, severely wounded. Capone becomes a loner. Whilst wasting away in prison, news from the outside world reaches him that is not encouraging. Prohibition is to be scrapped. Capone is aware that one of his most important sources of income has dried up. Somebody else is also badly affected by the end of Prohibition. Vincenzo, the prodigal son who fought for Prohibition, loses his job. The Capones receive a letter from him where he announces his return.
There had been different guys that had said, well, they were a Capone, but they turned out they weren't. Of course, they were trying to get into the family. The one thing, when he was confronted to his mother, that'd be my grandmother Teresa, he mentioned the fact that he went up this one alley, or that somebody went up this one alley to a certain place where they had goats, and they got goat's milk, and he had to drink so much goat's milk every day because he had some disease or something, sickness that he had. And who else would know that but him and his mother?
Ralph Capone and the most reliable members of the gang are now running the organization. Vincenzo is given an inconspicuous job. Jeff Hart was born much later. Long after Prohibition ended, he visited a bar with his uncle, Ralph Capone.
We stopped at this one bar, and we went in, and I always remember Uncle Ralph would stand up to the bar. He would very seldom sit at the bar. He would stand up. He happened to look behind the counter, and I think he saw a certain kind of beer back there, and he asked the bartender, he said, who are you buying that beer from? Where are you getting that beer? And the bartender, I don't recall a name, but he said, from so-and-so, and my Uncle Ralph said, don't buy from him anymore, okay? The bartender said, okay, Ralph. It was just like, whatever you say, Ralph. He said, okay, Ralph, and that was that. And I said to myself, yeah, Ralph still has the business. He still is in control of some things, and this was in 1971.
In 1939, due to his bad health, Al Capone is released from Alcatraz 3 years before his time. He moves to his home in Miami.
Al was in good shape as far as I was concerned in 1946. I mean, he was a good-sized man, and so many newspapers or even movies that have been put out on him depict him as a frail, weak. When he got out of prison, how he was so run down and everything. He was not that weak of a man at the time.
In 1946, at a large banquet, Harry Hart saw his uncle for the last time.
The place that we went to eat, it was a very big room, and the table was just like a lazy Susan, that turned around in the middle of it. And there was probably 20, 25 people sitting around this table. And I sat between Al and Ralph. Ralph told me to go down to a certain building where they had pool tables, and I went down there and played pool. I found out later that actually it was a bunch of guys from Chicago that were meeting.
At this gathering, the future of the organization is determined. Even the Capone gang has to change with the times.
What was done then in Chicago or in New York, still today influences, and for years had a heavy influence on what those cities were and how they functioned. The ties established between the gangsters and the politicians during Prohibition have continued up until, in many cases today or almost today, because once the politicians got into bed with the gangsters, they didn't just get back out again.
However, the politicians have already teamed up with different gangsters. The ghettos of the Italians and their arch-enemies, the Irish, are breaking up, and the open gang wars are increasingly replaced by diplomatic talks. The era of Al Capone is finally over.
Things had changed for Italian Americans. They were starting to get out of the ghettos. They were starting to get themselves educated. They were finding more job opportunities. So I don't think that Al Capone would have become a gangster. He demonstrated the ability to run a large organization. So I think that ability, that skill also would have translated into legitimate business. And that's why I say I think he probably would have run his own business, or he would have been, for instance, a corporate officer of some type.
In 1947, Al Capone dies. His corpse is transferred to Chicago, and the burial is witnessed only by family and close friends.
Al Capone was a vicious gangster.
But he had to be very smart.
No, I just remember that he was a bad guy.
And I'm sure he was very brutal.
He was a ruthless, cold-blooded killer.
He had to make a lot of very hard decisions that clearly affected people's lives or affected their life expectancy.
He was a great businessman. He had compassion, and he was an opportunist.
Corruption was the key to understanding Al Capone.
He was right for the time. His business was right for the time. That's how he became famous.
He was violating a federal law that nobody believed in.
In the end, Al Capone was mainly a prohibition-made man.
Thanks a lot, guys. You've been swell.
Thanks for coming, buddy. Hope you had a good time today. Thanks for coming along, pal. There. Hope you had a good time today, guys. Thanks for coming. Thanks for coming along, buddy. Thanks for coming. Hope to see you again, pal. You had a good time today. Now, good luck.